So I'm open to Module 4, where we will be covering Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. These are liking, love, and relationships, as well as social influence. Here is the to-do list for this module, and let's skip down to the chapter objectives. Chapter 7 is packed with information all regarding relationships, whether those be romantic, relationships or close friendships, as well as just what attracts us to one another in terms of any of those kinds of relationships. So the chapter is going to cover a lot of theory and explanation about affection and attraction. So it's going to start off by getting into our need for affiliation, that we are social creatures, and we use affiliation as a mode of expression. And it will go into some characteristics of that and how we use our emotions to attract mates, to attract friends, and how there are different variables that also sort of predict what or who we will be attracted to. So things like proximity and repeated exposure might help predict who we end up being friends with or who we fall in love with. And it will discuss some other characteristics and factors for which we judge physical attractiveness, since physical attractiveness is a key component to what attracts us to an individual overall. Friendships and more intimate relationships will want to understand, how do we base our scoring system, if you will, for physical attractiveness. We'll talk about some social concepts that sort of get in the way of that, some biases that we have, stereotypes, if you will, about being beautiful and what that means when we look at someone who in our culture we consider beautiful. There are different things that come to mind. They must be fill in the blank. And so that's where we can get into some biases there. We'll also look at some different theories as to what attracts us to mates. So when we're talking about romance and romantic relationships, what is to be said there in terms of, opposites attracting or being alike in personality or certain traits of the individual. We'll get into some hypotheses regarding all of that, regarding mate selection. There's different theories as to how we go about selecting our mates. And then we'll get into some more in terms of family relationships, parent-child, siblings, as well as attachment styles. Some of you may be familiar with attachment, the area of attachment. If you've taken developmental psych, it's often covered also in intro psych. How do we attach to people? It's often predicted by or a result of how we attached to our parents. So that attachment style we have with our parents, be it good or be it bad, can often predict then how we'll attach romantically later and with friendships and how those friendships function. And then we'll get into some key differences between a romantic relationship and friendships, get into Sternberg's theory of love, the triangular model, which talks about all the different combinations we see when it comes to love, and then some gender differences in terms of what men and women seek in romantic partners. Okay, so that finishes that chapter. Then we will get into a very different chapter, social influence. You'll actually see some topics pop up that are reminiscent of the social cognition and the social perception chapter, as well as the chapter on attitudes that we just finished. All of that's going to kind of come into play here as we start to talk about some key areas. Now, this chapter is all about these areas of conformity, compliance, obedience, and social influence overall. Okay. In order to understand these, the chapter is going to break kind of each down into different segments. So it'll start with talking about social norms and how those function in our society and in our culture, and how we use those norms to predict and to indicate what we will and will not conform to. So the area of conformity is going along with the group. It's conforming. And sometimes we hear the word conformity and we think negatively of it. Oh, who wants to conform? I want to be a standout. I want to be an individual. It's kind of the American way to be individualistic. However, conformity is necessary to some degree. If we do not have conformity, we do not have a society. If everybody did their own thing at their own time, at their own pace, we wouldn't be able to get anything done as a society. We wouldn't be able to work together and work in groups. We wouldn't have rules and laws governing our society. So a certain sense of conformity is necessary. However, what happens when conformity is not good? What happens when there are negative aspects to it? When other factors can affect our conformity, like the size of the group and cohesiveness. We act differently depending upon who we're around. We've already kind of established that. So there are different factors that affect how we get along when it comes to different norms of what our society says we should and shouldn't do. So given a certain situation, how should we act? How do most people act? That will often tell you something about how the individual will then act. Will they defy the norms? Will they go along with them? When we see people defying norms very regularly and strongly, we tend to think of that as abnormal behavior. And in fact, that is one of the key areas that often go along with an indication of abnormal behavior. So we'll get into some reasons as to why people do and do not conform. Then we're going to move down into the area of compliance. Compliance is going along with a direct request of another person or indirect request. So conformity is kind of like, we want to fit in or we're going to fit in because of the norms that dictate that. Compliance is more like, I feel like I need to do this. It feels compelling to me. Maybe I've been asked to. Someone has made a request that I attend a party with them or buy a product. And so compliance involves many different principles that might then affect whether or not we go along with said request. And in fact, Cialdini will talk about the different tactics people can actually use to gain compliance in others. Okay, so this is a big area in marketing and advertising and business in general. This is what is used when ad campaigns are put together to sway people into buying a product or joining a political party or voting a certain way or following a certain pattern of behavior, joining a club. These individuals might use different tactics that get people to comply. The last part of the chapter will move into the area of obedience research, and this is largely spearheaded by Milgram. Some of you have mentioned Milgram when we talked early on about ethical considerations in research. His famous shock study was one that was brought up for ethical reasons, basically not being very ethical in the way it was conducted. But in running his studies, we learned so much about obedience. When we obey, why are we doing it? And under what circumstances do we obey? Whether it be parents, teachers, military commanders, co-workers, bosses. We obey instructions, we obey commands all the time. And obedience is necessary in many regards, otherwise we'd have unruly students, we'd have a military that is chaotic, we'd have a government that nobody followed any orders. But sometimes obedience can be destructive. If we're obeying just authority, that's great, and we should. If we're obeying unjust authority, like someone is put in a position of power and they are ordering people to do things that are unethical and not right, that's another thing. And when an order is given, Do we follow it or do we not follow it? If an order goes against our good conscience, what do we do? So that's where we get into the psychological basis for destructive obedience. And the Milgram studies are super interesting. So some of that's going to come back up as we watch videos this week and we learn more about that. Here are your lecture slides. The article readings are 19 and 26. And then we have a few extra videos. So aside from the Revel videos, which again, the Revel videos will pop up in the ebook reading. So as you're reading the ebook in Revel, the video icons will appear and tell you when there's a video. That's the only way you can access them. There's no separate way to access those videos, but you'll want to watch those within the ebook reading. And then you can move into watching these. Most of these are quick little campaign ads that I've put up so you can see examples of someone breaking a social norm, emotional branding, which is used to gain compliance in marketing strategies. It's pretty interesting. Ash's conformity study. Ash will be talked about in your textbook as well, and how he figured out when we are and aren't likely to conform. What conditions need to be present for us to conform with the group and to go along with the norms of the group. And when do we not conform? So you'll want to watch that. And some recent kind of Ash outtakes are talked about in your book. What's been done since his study? What have we learned? Then you're going to want to watch this video here. You can stop it at about halfway through. It talks about conformity, and then it talks about groupthink. Groupthink we're going to get into in either, I believe it's the last module that we cover in class. But for now, you'll want to pay attention to the segment on conformity. It's really good. And then lastly, we have the Abu Ghraib prison atrocity. This is kind of like a modern, real-life circumstance that mirrors the Milgram study a little bit. What happens when we get people in positions of power that take advantage of that power. It's where obedience goes destructive. And this is a real scenario that happened in one of our military prisons in Abu Ghraib. And you'll kind of get a sense of what happened there in that whole situation. So those are the videos for you this week. And I think in the Revel videos, there's also one about a modern day Milgram study. I'm going to check on that for you. And if I don't see it in there, I'll go ahead and I'll add it in. But it's good. It's Jerry Berger's study. And he kind of did a mock Milgram study, a modern day Milgram study, to see if Milgram's findings would still hold true today. And it's interesting what he found. So I'll look and see if that's in Revel, and if it's not, I'll put it up for you guys. Your discussion this week, again, focuses on the 2 articles, but you should also, again, be integrating in the chapter readings as well as the videos where applicable. So you're going to be talking a little bit about attraction. What do we see as attractive today versus back in the 50s and 60s? Again, you want to be integrating in concepts from the main chapter readings. There's so much opportunity here to do that. You don't want to just be citing the authors of the article. You want to be citing what you read in chapter 7 with attraction. Okay. Then article 26 is where we get into chapter 8 with the Milgram study and the Abu Ghraib prison video. So of course you have to be able to watch those before you can answer this question, and you want to be integrating in those videos as well as the readings. And then you have your exam, and that kind of wraps up this module. Again, as always, if you have any questions, please email me. Email is the best because I check it the most frequently and I usually respond pretty quickly. If you put a question in the Ask Dr. W in the communications tab, I will see it, but I only check that maybe once a day. So it may be a slower response for you. Okay? Good luck, everybody, and have a great time working with love, attraction, and social influence.